Do you know who you just put in cuffs, officer? The man's voice was eerily calm, cutting through the wail of police sirens. Officer Scott West smirked, slamming the holding cell door. I don't care if you're the president, buddy. In my town, you're just another perp who didn't know his place. But Scott didn't know the man bleeding in his cell was active duty Army Colonel Brandon Lewis. And he definitely didn't know that in exactly 14 minutes, 3 militarized Black Hawk helicopters would descend on his small-town precinct, turning his arrogant world to ash. The sweltering summer heat of Kentucky hung over Highway 41A like a suffocating wet blanket. It was a notoriously desolate stretch of road that served as a pipeline between the sprawling, highly secured gates of Fort Campbell and the sleepy, often overlooked town of Oak Grove. For Officer Scott West, this highway was his personal kingdom. West was a man who wore his badge not as a shield for the innocent, but as a crown. He was 10 years into a career that had stalled out due to multiple complaints of excessive force and a profound lack of respect for procedure. But in Oak Grove, a town with a microscopic budget and a desperate need for revenue, West's aggressive ticketing policies made him untouchable, or so he believed, Sitting in his squad car, the air conditioning blasting against his flushed face, West tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the shimmering asphalt. It was the end of the month, and his citation quota was glaringly short. He needed a victim. Someone out of state, or better yet, someone passing through who wouldn't have the time or resources to return and fight a ticket in rural traffic court. At exactly 1800 hours, a sleek, unmarked black Chevrolet Tahoe blew past his cruiser. It was moving fast, purposefully fast, though not recklessly so. West's radar gun pinged at 62 in a 45-mile-per-hour zone. It was a marginal infraction, the kind a reasonable officer might let slide with a warning or a simple flash of the lights. But West wasn't reasonable. He saw an expensive SUV with dark-tinted windows and out-of-state government plates. He saw a payday. Flipping on his light bar, the red and blue strobes violently illuminated the darkening tree line. West punched the gas, his cruiser roaring to life, tires throwing gravel as he merged onto the highway. He rode the bumper of the Tahoe, his siren wailing with an aggressive, piercing shriek intended to intimidate. Inside the Tahoe sat Colonel Brandon Lewis. Lewis was a man carved from granite, possessing a resume that read like a classified geopolitical thriller. He was a commanding officer attached to the elite Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, working directly with the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the legendary Night Stalkers. At this precise moment, Lewis was not a man taking a leisurely evening drive. He was in civilian tactical gear, a dark polo shirt, cargo pants, and a subdued tactical watch, and was in the middle of a highly encrypted, time-sensitive, secure communication with the Pentagon. A high-value target had been located domestically, and Lewis was en route to Fort Campbell to greenlight a joint agency apprehension task force. Every second counted. Seeing the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, Lewis let out a quiet, disciplined sigh. He didn't have time for this, but he respected the rule of law. He signaled, pulling the heavy Tahoe smoothly onto the gravel shoulder, ensuring there was plenty of room for the officer to approach safely. Lewis kept his engine running to maintain power to his encrypted satellite uplink, rolled down his window and placed both of his large, calloused hands firmly on the top of the steering wheel. It was standard procedure. Officer West approached the vehicle, his hand resting theatrically on the butt of his service weapon. He adopted a wide, arrogant stance as he reached the driver's window, shining his high-powered maglight directly into Lewis's eyes despite the remaining daylight. "Do you have any idea how fast you were going, pal?" West barked, his tone dripping with immediate condescension. Lewis blinked against the harsh light, his voice even and respectful. "Officer, I was tracking approximately 60. I apologize for the speed, but I am currently under orders and in transit to a time-sensitive military briefing at Fort Campbell. Here is my ID." Lewis didn't reach for his pocket. Instead, he gestured to his military identification card and his driver's license, which he had preemptively placed on the dashboard to avoid any sudden movements. West scoffed, snatching the cards off the dash. He barely glanced at the Department of Defense identification that clearly stated Lewis's rank as an 06 colonel. To West, military brass were just local nuisances who thought they owned the area. "I don't care if you're late for a parade, soldier boy," West sneered, leaning his face closer to the window, the smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco wafting into the Tahoe. "You were doing 85, that's reckless driving. Step out of the vehicle." Lewis's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Officer, I assure you I was not doing 85. I have an onboard GPS telemetry system that records my exact speed. Furthermore, I am on a classified federal operation. I cannot abandon this vehicle or this secure communication line. I respectfully request that you issue the citation so I may be on my way, or call your watch commander. That was the wrong thing to say to a man with an ego as fragile as Officer West's. The suggestion that he wasn't the highest authority on this desolate stretch of road made West's blood boil. He unclipped his holster. I'm not asking, buddy. I'm telling. Step out of the car or I will drag you out. The silence that followed West's threat was deafening, broken only by the hum of the Tahoe's engine and the distant chirp of summer cicadas. Colonel Brandon Lewis had faced down hardened insurgents in the mountains of Afghanistan and negotiated with warlords in the Horn of Africa. He was an expert at de-escalation, but he also recognized a man who was actively looking for an excuse to use violence. Officer, Lewis said, his voice dropping an octave, radiating a quiet, dangerous authority. I am going to turn off the engine. I am going to step out of the vehicle. My hands will remain visible at all times. I strongly advise you to reconsider your current course of action. You are interfering with a federal mandate. Shut your mouth and get out, West yelled, his face turning a mottled red. He drew his taser, pointing the red laser dot directly at Lewis's chest. Lewis smoothly killed the ignition, killing the secure comms line in the process, a critical disruption that he knew would trigger immediate red flags at the Pentagon. He opened the door and stepped out. He was a physically imposing man, standing 6'3" with shoulders that seemed to block out the setting sun. For a split second, West felt a flicker of genuine intimidation, but his arrogance quickly smothered it. Turn around, hands on the roof, now, West commanded, stepping forward aggressively. Lewis complied, turning his back to the officer and placing his hands flat against the hot metal of the SUV. He offered no resistance, assuming the officer would simply pat him down, realize his mistake, and issue the ticket. But West was running on adrenaline and bruised pride. Without warning, West lunged forward, kicking Lewis's legs apart violently and slamming his forearm into the back of Lewis's neck, crushing the colonel's face against the roof of the Tahoe. Stop resisting! West screamed, a standard rehearsed phrase designed for his dashcam audio, completely contrary to reality. I am not resisting, Lewis stated clearly, his voice muffled against the metal but remarkably devoid of panic. He didn't tense his muscles, he didn't fight back. Doing so would only validate the corrupt cop's narrative. West grabbed Lewis's left arm, violently wrenching it behind his back and slapping on a pair of handcuffs, ratcheting the metal teeth down so hard they immediately bit into Lewis's wrists, drawing blood. He repeated the brutal process with the right arm. You military guys think you're above the law, West grunted, violently yanking Lewis backward by the chain of the cuffs, causing sharp pain to shoot through the colonel's shoulders. Out here, I'm the law. You're under arrest for reckless driving, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer. Lewis turned his head slightly, locking eyes with West. His gaze was devoid of anger, but it held a chilling, absolute certainty. Assaulting an officer? You have dashcam footage rolling, correct? It will show I was fully compliant. My dashcam's been glitchy all week, West lied with a greasy smile. Now get in the back of the squad. West shoved the decorated war hero toward the cruiser, forcing him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat. As the cruiser door slammed shut, Lewis sat in the stifling heat, blood trickling down his wrist onto his tactical pants. He calculated his next move. His primary concern wasn't his own comfort or the fabricated charges, it was the broken comms link. A joint special operations task force was currently blind because a small-town bully wanted to stroke his own ego. West slid into the driver's seat, radioing dispatch. Oak Grove Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have one in custody, transporting to the station for booking, requesting a tow for an abandoned vehicle on 41A. Cancel the tow, Lewis said from the back seat, his voice cutting through the plexiglass partition. That vehicle contains classified Department of Defense communication equipment. If a civilian tow company attempts to move it, the vehicle's automated countermeasures will engage and you will have a catastrophic federal incident on your hands. West laughed out loud, putting the car in drive. Listen to you, trying to sound like James Bond. It's a Chevy, buddy. It's going to the impound lot. Officer West, Lewis said, reading the name off the man's badge. "I am telling you this for your own safety and the safety of this town. Do not touch that vehicle." Something in Lewis's tone finally penetrated West's thick skull. The absolute lack of fear, the clinical precision of his words. West decided to leave the Tahoe for now. He could always have it towed later. He threw the cruiser into gear and sped off toward the Oak Grove precinct, unaware that by breaking Lewis's comms, he had just painted a massive, invisible target directly on his own back. The Oak Grove police precinct was exactly what one would expect from an underfunded rural town. It was a single-story brick building that smelled persistently of bleach, stale donuts, and cheap floor wax. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly yellow hue over the peeling linoleum floors. West marched Colonel Lewis through the double-glass doors, his hand firmly gripping the chain of the handcuffs to maintain his facade of dominance. A few other officers and civilian administrative staff looked up from their desks. They saw a composed, highly disciplined man in tactical civilian clothes bleeding from the wrists, being shoved along by West, who was wearing a triumphant, predatory grin. "Got a live one tonight, Scotty?" asked Deputy Miller, an older, lethargic cop who was busy picking at a styrofoam container of takeout. "High-speed pursuit, resisting, the whole 9 yards," West lied seamlessly, pushing Lewis toward the booking desk. "Thinks he's a hotshot because he's got a military ID." Lewis stood in front of the booking camera. He didn't grimace. He didn't complain about the cuffs that were cutting off his circulation. He simply stared directly into the lens with cold, calculating intensity. "Empty your pockets," West ordered, finally removing the handcuffs. Lewis rubbed his raw, bleeding wrists slowly, maintaining eye contact with West. Lewis systematically emptied his cargo pockets. A heavy tungsten pen, a slim wallet, and finally, a sleek, heavy black satellite phone that looked like it belonged on a spacecraft rather than in a Kentucky police station. West reached for the phone. No cell phones in the cell. Before West's fingers could touch the device, Lewis's hand clamped down on the officer's wrist with the speed of a striking viper and the crushing force of a vice. West gasped, his knees buckling slightly under the intense, targeted pressure. He reached for his belt, panic flaring in his eyes. "Do not touch that device," Lewis warned, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "It is federal property. It requires a biometric scan to unlock. If you attempt to access it, it will wipe its internal memory, and you will be facing espionage charges under the Patriot Act. I will power it down, and it will go into lockbox holding. Do you understand me?" Lewis released the wrist. West stumbled back, holding his arm, his face pale. The other officers in the room had stood up, hands hovering near their holsters, but none had drawn. The sheer, overwhelming aura of command radiating from Lewis had paralyzed the room. West, trying to regain his shattered dignity, puffed out his chest. "Put it in the bin! You're going in the cage, tough guy!" Lewis powered down the device, placed it in the plastic booking bin alongside his wallet and ID, and calmly walked himself into the holding cell, a 10-by-10 concrete room with a stainless steel toilet and a rigid metal bench. As West slammed the heavy iron bars shut, he sneered, "Do you know who you just put in cuffs, officer?" West laughed, recovering his bravado now that there was iron between him and the colonel. "I don't care if you're the president, buddy. In my town, you're just another perp who didn't know his place." Lewis sat on the metal bench, his posture perfect. "I am invoking my right to a single phone call, and I suggest you look very closely at the credentials in my wallet, Officer West." West rolled his eyes, but he walked over to the booking bin. He picked up Lewis's DOD identification. He looked at the rank, 06. Colonel. He looked at the command affiliation. It didn't just say U.S. Army. It had an eagle holding an anchor and trident flanked by lightning bolts. Deputy Miller walked over, adjusting his glasses. He peered at the card and suddenly turned a shade of sickly white. "Scott, you idiot," Miller whispered, his voice trembling. "That's Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. This guy is a full bird colonel. He's Tier 1. West scoffed, though a seed of doubt finally took root in his stomach. "So what? State law applies to G.I. Joes too. He was speeding." "Scott, give him his phone call," Miller pleaded, backing away from the desk. "Now!" West swallowed hard, grabbed a cordless landline from the desk, and shoved it through the bars of the cell. "Make it quick." Lewis didn't take the phone immediately. He looked at West. "The number I am about to dial is a direct line to the Pentagon Command Center. I am going to report a critical disruption to Operation Blackbird. You have approximately 10 minutes to figure out how you are going to explain this to the Department of Defense. Lewis dialed a memorized 202 area code number. He waited 2 seconds, then spoke a sequence of alphanumeric codes. Broken arrow on transit. Local LE interference. Oak Grove precinct. Send the cavalry. We have lost containment on the primary target. He hung up and handed the phone back through the bars. Then he sat back, closed his eyes, and waited. For 12 agonizing minutes, nothing happened. The Oak Grove precinct settled back into its mundane routine, though the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Officer West sat at his desk, furiously typing up his arrest report. He was stacking the document with every conceivable exaggeration to justify the arrest. Erratic lane changes, aggressive posturing, smelling of alcohol. If he was going to take down a military officer, he needed the paperwork to be airtight. Deputy Miller paced nervously by the water cooler, repeatedly glancing toward the holding cell where Colonel Lewis sat completely motionless, appearing more like a statue than a prisoner. "You're making a mistake, Scott," Miller muttered for the third time. "You don't mess with SOCOM. Those guys operate outside the normal rules. They answer to the president." "Shut up, Miller. He's a guy in pants and a shirt. The military can't touch us here. Posse comitatus, remember? The army can't act as domestic law enforcement. We have jurisdiction." West hit print on his keyboard, feeling a surge of misplaced confidence. By the time his JAG lawyers show up tomorrow morning, he'll be processed, bailed out, and it'll be a civilian court matter. West reached for his styrofoam cup of coffee. As his fingers brushed the rim, he noticed something strange. The dark liquid inside the cup was vibrating. Tiny concentric ripples danced across the surface of the coffee. Then the sound hit them. It didn't start loud. It began as a deep, resonant vibration in the chest, a low-frequency hum that rattled the loose ceiling tiles and made the window panes chatter in their frames. "Is that a train?" Miller asked, looking around wildly. The nearest tracks were miles away. The hum grew rapidly, evolving into a deafening, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack that seemed to swallow all other noise in the world. It was the distinct, terrifying acoustic signature of heavy military rotor blades beating the air into submission. West stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked toward the front entrance, pulling open the glass door. The humid night air was suddenly entirely displaced by a violent, localized hurricane. The trees lining the precinct parking lot were bending violently backward. A massive cloud of dust, trash, and gravel was kicked up, severely limiting visibility. Through the swirling maelstrom, West saw them. Not one, but 3 matte black MH-60M Black Hawk helicopters. These weren't standard medical evacuation choppers. These were the highly modified, heavily armed birds of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. They didn't land at a nearby airfield. They didn't ask for airspace clearance from the local tower. They descended directly onto the precinct. The lead Black Hawk hovered a mere 20 feet above the precinct's small parking lot, its downdraft so incredibly powerful that it ripped the light bar straight off the roof of West's parked cruiser, sending plastic and wiring flying into the street. The other 2 choppers flared out, taking up flanking positions over the adjacent vacant lots, their searchlights illuminating the precinct in blinding, hostile white light. "What the hell?" West screamed over the deafening roar, shielding his face from the flying debris. Before the lead chopper even touched down, thick, braided fast ropes dropped from the open side doors. Dark, heavily armed figures began sliding down the ropes with terrifying speed and precision. They wore full tactical combat gear, panoramic night vision goggles, and carried short-barreled assault rifles. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were Delta Force operators moving with a silent, lethal coordination that made West's heart stop, dead in his chest. They hit the asphalt, immediately fanning out and establishing a perimeter around the building. They didn't aim their weapons at the police officers, but they held them at the low ready, creating an impenetrable wall of elite firepower. The lead Black Hawk finally touched down, its wheels bouncing heavily on the asphalt. The side door slid open wider and 2 men stepped out unaffected by the rotor wash. One was wearing a sharp, dark suit with an FBI windbreaker. The other was a man in an army combat uniform bearing the twin silver stars of a major general on his chest. They marched straight toward the front doors of the Oak Grove Police Department. West stumbled backward into the lobby, his hand instinctively dropping to his sidearm. "Lock the doors! Lock the doors!" He panicked, shouting at Miller, but it was too late. The double glass doors were shoved open with such force that one of the hinges cracked. The Major General and the FBI agent strode into the lobby, followed by 4 Delta operators who immediately secured the exits. The Oak Grove precinct had just been breached. The lobby of the Oak Grove precinct fell into an absolute suffocating silence, save for the deafening roar of the helicopters idling outside. Every local officer was frozen, their hands raised in instinctive surrender. West stood in the centre of the room, his hand still resting nervously on the grip of his pistol. He was terrified, but his ego refused to let him submit completely. "This is local jurisdiction," West yelled, his voice cracking slightly. "You have no authority here. Posse comitatus forbids—" "Shut your mouth and take your hand off your weapon, officer," the Major General commanded. His voice wasn't a yell, it was a devastatingly calm order that carried the weight of the entire United States military. "If you unholster that firearm, you will be neutralized before it clears leather." The 4 Delta operators in the room shifted their stances almost imperceptibly. It was enough. West slowly moved his hand away from his belt, swallowing a lump of pure fear. The man in the FBI windbreaker stepped forward, flashing a badge. "Special Agent Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Counterterrorism Division. Who is the arresting officer of Colonel Brandon Lewis?" West hesitated, looking around for support, but his fellow officers had stepped back, metaphorically throwing him to the wolves. "I am," West stammered. "He was speeding, 85 in a 45. He resisted arrest." Agent Vance didn't even blink. "Where is he?" Deputy Miller pointed a trembling finger toward the holding cells. The Major General didn't wait for a key. He gestured to one of the operators who stepped up to the metal gate of the holding cell with a massive pair of hydraulic bolt cutters. With a loud snap, the heavy padlock was severed. The gate swung open. Colonel Lewis stepped out of the cell. He looked exactly as he had when he walked in. Calm, composed, and imposing. He didn't look at West. He looked directly at the General and saluted. "General, we lost the feed. The target's convoy was moving toward the state line," Lewis reported, completely ignoring the fact that he was in a police station with bleeding wrists. "We know, Brandon," the General replied, returning the salute. "NSA caught the signal drop. We deployed drone overwatch, but we lost visual in the Appalachian canopy. We are currently blind. We need you back at command to authorize the satellite retasking." Lewis nodded. He walked over to the booking bin and retrieved his sat phone, wallet, and ID. He then turned slowly and locked eyes with Officer West. The air in the room seemed to freeze. 85 in a 45, Lewis repeated quietly. He turned to Agent Vance. "Agent, I request you secure the dashcam footage from this officer's cruiser immediately. I also request you secure the precinct's internal security footage. You will find that I was fully compliant, that I was illegally assaulted, and that this officer fabricated the charges." West's face drained of all colour. You can't just come in here and take our evidence. I'm the chief, the acting commander tonight. I'll call the mayor." Agent Vance pulled a folded document from his inside jacket pocket and slapped it hard onto West's chest. West reflexively grabbed it. "That is a federal warrant," Vance said, his voice dripping with absolute disdain. "Signed by a federal judge 10 minutes ago. We are seizing all electronic records, body cameras, and dash cams belonging to you and this precinct. Colonel Lewis was commanding a classified multi-agency operation tracking a domestic terror cell. Your little power trip, Officer West, just gave them a 30-minute head start." The chief of the Oak Grove Police Department, an older man who had been asleep in his back office, finally stumbled into the lobby, his uniform untucked, eyes wide with horror at the military occupation of his station. "What in God's name is going on here?" the chief demanded. The general turned to the chief. "Your officer unlawfully detained a federal commander during a national security crisis. He has committed severe federal crimes." The general pointed a rigid finger at West. "Strip his badge, now." The chief looked at West, then at the heavily armed Special Forces operators, and finally at the furious 2-star general. He didn't hesitate. "West, give me your badge and your gun. You are suspended, pending immediate termination." "Chief, you can't be serious. He was speeding," West pleaded, his voice pitching into a pathetic whine. "Give me the badge, Scott, or I'll have these gentlemen take it from you," the chief growled. With trembling hands, West unpinned the silver star from his chest and unclipped his duty belt, letting it drop to the floor with a heavy thud. In less than an hour, he had gone from the king of Highway 41A to a disgraced, unemployed man staring down the barrel of the federal government. Lewis didn't stay to watch the rest of West's humiliation. He had a mission to salvage. He walked out of the shattered glass doors of the precinct, stepping into the chaotic, wind-whipped parking lot. The lead Black Hawk was waiting, its rotors still spinning furiously. The general fell in step beside him. "We can make up the lost time, Brandon. We have a JSOC team on standby in Nashville." "Make the call, General. I'll brief them in the air," Lewis said, climbing into the belly of the helicopter. As the Black Hawk lifted off, pulling away into the night sky, Lewis looked down at the Oak Grove precinct. He saw Officer Scott West being led to a chair in the lobby by FBI agents, his head in his hands. Lewis felt no vindication, no joy at the man's downfall. He only felt frustration at the sheer, senseless waste of time caused by one man's unchecked ego. The operation to apprehend the terror cell was successful, but it took 3 additional days and nearly cost the lives of 2 federal agents, a direct result of the delay caused on Highway 41A. When the dust finally settled, the hammer of karma came down on Scott West with biblical force. The FBI meticulously reviewed the seized dashcam footage. It clearly showed Lewis fully complying with all orders, keeping his hands visible and offering no resistance. It also captured the audio of West fabricating the speed, ignoring Lewis's federal credentials, and the sickening sound of West slamming the colonel's head into the roof of the SUV. The Department of Justice did not treat the incident as a simple case of police misconduct. They treated it as an attack on a federal operation. 3 months later, Scott West stood in a federal courtroom in Louisville. He wasn't wearing a police uniform, he was wearing an orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit. The federal prosecutor, a razor-sharp lawyer who specialized in civil rights violations, systematically dismantled West's life. The defendant, acting under the color of law, willfully deprived Colonel Brandon Lewis of his constitutional rights, the prosecutor stated to the jury. But more than that, his blinding arrogance and deep-seated corruption actively obstructed a critical national security operation. He put the lives of American citizens at risk because he wanted to feel powerful on a dark stretch of highway. West sat at the defense table, a hollow shell of the bully he used to be. His wife had left him. His pension was gone. His so-called brothers in blue had completely turned their backs on him, eager to distance themselves from his radioactive reputation. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Scott West guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law, Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242, obstruction of a federal officer, and aggravated assault. The federal judge, a stern woman with zero tolerance for corrupt cops, looked down at West from the bench. "Mr. West, law enforcement is a sacred trust. You treated it as a weapon to terrorize those you perceived as weaker than you. You picked the wrong man, on the wrong night. You are sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, without the possibility of early parole." As the bailiff clamped heavy iron handcuffs around West's wrists, a poetic mirroring of the cuffs he had slapped on Lewis months prior, West looked back at the gallery. Sitting in the back row, wearing a perfectly pressed Class A Army uniform, was Colonel Brandon Lewis. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't smiling, he was simply watching the justice system work as it was intended. Lewis offered a single, slow nod, then stood up and walked out of the courtroom, returning to the shadows to protect a country that, despite men like Scott West, was still worth fighting for. As the heavy oak doors of the courtroom closed behind the colonel, the sharp click of the lock echoed in West's ears, the final, undeniable sound of his own karma. What an absolutely incredible turn of events. Officer West thought he was the ultimate authority, untouchable in his small town, but he learned the hard way that true power doesn't come from bullying people on the side of a highway. The arrival of those Black Hawks is a moment that gives you absolute chills. It just goes to show that karma has a way of catching up to those who abuse their power, and sometimes karma wears night vision goggles and carries a federal warrant. If you love this intense story of justice and karma striking back, make sure to smash that like button to help this video reach more people. Share this story with your friends who love a satisfying ending. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss out on our thrilling stories. What did you think of the Colonel's calm reaction? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.